start the boat.
Johnny Carson made comedy history for 30 years, but only a handful of guests could make him lose control on live television. These are not just funny people. These are the 10 performers who turned Carson's couch into a stage for pure chaos, raw talent, and moments television has never forgotten. One guest crashed a scene unannounced and left the entire crew in stitches. Another turned a single joke into a career-launching moment. From explosive energy to razor-sharp insults, each name on this list changed The Tonight Show forever. Stick around, because number 1 still gets talked about decades later. Picture a comedian walking onto national television and doing magic tricks through the fly of his own pants. That actually happened, and it happened because Johnny Carson trusted this man completely. Steve Martin's relationship with Carson started back in 1972, long before movie stardom, long before Father of the Bride, long before he became one of America's most beloved entertainers. Back then he was just a young stand-up with a banjo, a bag of tricks, and a completely absurd sense of humor that didn't look like anything else on television. Carson saw something in him immediately. While other hosts might have been thrown off by a comedian doing balloon animals or falling flat on his face mid-sentence, Carson leaned into it. He gave Martin room to be as weird as he wanted, and that trust turned into one of the most beloved comedian relationships in late-night history. Martin's act during this era became known as the wild and crazy guy routine, and audiences couldn't get enough of it. Physical comedy, perfectly timed pratfalls, absurd non-sequiturs, all delivered with a straight face that somehow made everything funnier. Carson would sit there completely disarmed, unable to keep his composure, and that reaction became part of the show's magic. 20 years into their relationship, something remarkable happened. In May of 1992, just weeks before Carson's own retirement from The Tonight Show, Steve Martin came back one final time. He performed what fans still call the Great Fly Magic routine, a bit so ridiculous and so perfectly executed that it instantly became one of the most memorable moments in the show's entire history. Think about that timing for a second. Carson was closing out 3 decades of television. He could have brought back anyone for one of his final shows. He chose Steve Martin, a comedian he'd watched grow from an unknown stand-up into a full-blown movie star, right there in front of him. That's the kind of bond these two built. Carson didn't just book Martin because he was funny. He booked him because their chemistry was real, spontaneous, and completely unmatched. Every appearance felt like watching 2 old friends who genuinely enjoyed making each other laugh. Martin eventually moved on from stand-up into film, then into music, then into writing novels, building one of the most versatile careers in entertainment history. But those early Carson years captured something you can't fake. A young performer at his most fearless, willing to try absolutely anything, paired with a host who knew exactly how to let that fearlessness shine. 20 years of appearances, one unforgettable final bit, and a friendship that defined an era of comedy. That's Steve Martin's legacy on Johnny Carson's couch, and it's exactly why he tops this list.
Don Rickles.
There was one guest Johnny Carson never fully controlled, and he liked it that way. His name was Don Rickles, and every time he stepped onto that stage, anything could happen. Rickles built his entire career on insult comedy, a style that could have gone horribly wrong in the wrong hands. Instead, in his hands, it became must-watch television. He would walk out, look Carson dead in the eye, and unload rapid-fire insults that left the host gasping for air between laughs. Nobody was safe. Not Carson, not the audience, not the crew standing off camera. Rickles once summed up his own act perfectly, joking that his biggest fear was that somewhere in the crowd sat one person he hadn't managed to offend yet. What made this work wasn't just the jokes themselves. It was the trust underneath them. Carson understood exactly what Rickles was doing. He knew none of it came from real malice, that it was pure performance, craftsmanship built on timing and audacity. That understanding let Carson relax completely and just enjoy the ride, which meant the audience got to enjoy it too. But the insults were only half the story. The other half was pure chaos, and nothing captures that better than February of 1968. Carson was in the middle of a bit, dressed in a Speedo for a Japanese massage gag, completely locked into the scene, when Rickles burst onto the set completely unannounced. No warning, no cue, just Rickles crashing straight through the fourth wall. The studio lost it instantly. Crew members who were supposed to stay professional were doubled over. Carson eventually got his own moment of revenge, tackling Rickles right there on stage in a scuffle that somehow made the entire thing even funnier. That wasn't a one-time thing either. Years later in 1976, Carson stormed off his own set mid-show to confront Rickles next door over a broken cigarette box, another completely unscripted moment that turned into television gold. These two built a dynamic where nobody watching ever knew what was coming next, and that unpredictability is exactly what made it must-see TV decade after decade. Rickles appeared on The Tonight Show dozens of times across the years, and Carson respected something specific about him: the sheer nerve it took to say absolutely anything to anyone, live, with cameras rolling. That kind of fearlessness is rare, and Carson knew he had something special every single time Rickles walked out. Fans and critics alike have called him the greatest guest in the history of talk shows, and watching these clips today, it's hard to argue otherwise. The chemistry, the chaos, the total lack of a script, all of it added up to something no other guest ever quite replicated. That's why, out of everyone who ever sat on that couch, Don Rickles claims the very top spot.
Third, would you welcome Jerry Seinfeld?
May of 1981 changed everything for a 26-year-old comedian nobody outside the New York club circuit had heard of yet. His name was Jerry Seinfeld, and one appearance on The Tonight Show was about to flip his entire career upside down. At the time, Seinfeld was just another young stand-up trying to get noticed. There was no sitcom, no fame, nothing beyond raw talent and sharp observational jokes about the small absurdities of everyday life. Then he stepped on Carson's stage, delivered a set built on clever wordplay and low-key precision, and something clicked. Carson was genuinely impressed, so much so that he asked Seinfeld to come back soon after, an incredibly rare honor for a first-time guest. That single moment became a turning point. Seinfeld later admitted that hearing Carson simply ask if he'd come back on gave him a massive confidence boost at exactly the moment he needed it most. Think about how much weight that carries. One of the most respected hosts in television history, personally signaling that this unknown comic had something real. What makes this story even more remarkable is the timing. All of Seinfeld's early standout Tonight Show appearances happened years before his sitcom ever aired. There was no Seinfeld show backing him up, no built-in audience, nothing except raw talent on a stage in front of millions of viewers. Carson gave him that platform purely because the material worked, because the delivery worked, because a young nobody from New York clearly had something worth watching. Carson appreciated something specific about Seinfeld's style too. He didn't need shock value or profanity to land a laugh. Everything came from precision, from noticing details everyone else missed and turning them into something universally funny. That kind of comedy ages well, and it's exactly why Seinfeld kept coming back throughout the 80s, appearing at least a half dozen more times, always delivering that same reliable, thoughtful humor. By 1989, less than a decade after that first nervous walk onto Carson's stage, Seinfeld had become the star of NBC's top-rated sitcom, a show that would eventually define an entire era of television comedy. Decades later, Seinfeld still performs constantly, still headlines Netflix specials, still fills arenas around the world. But he's never stopped crediting those early Carson appearances as the true starting point. A young comic with no fame and no safety net, given one shot on national television, and turning it into the foundation of one of the biggest careers in comedy history. That's Jerry Seinfeld's story on Johnny Carson's couch.
Burt Reynolds.
Most people remember Burt Reynolds as an action star, the guy behind the wheel in high-speed car chases and tough guy roles across Hollywood. But put him next to Johnny Carson, and something completely different came out. Pure, unscripted comedic chaos. Reynolds appeared on The Tonight Show an astonishing number of times, somewhere around 61 visits across the years. That kind of frequency alone tells you something. This wasn't a guest who showed up to promote a movie and leave. This was a guest Carson genuinely wanted back again and again, because every single appearance turned into something unforgettable. The chemistry between them wasn't manufactured. It was real, loose, and completely unpredictable, the kind of dynamic that can't be scripted no matter how hard a writer's room tries. And nothing captures that better than one specific moment that's still talked about decades later, when Reynolds casually dumped whipped cream straight into Carson's lap in the middle of what started as an ordinary interview. No warning, no setup, just pure impulse. Both men lost it instantly, and that laughter spread through the entire studio like wildfire. One Tonight Show retrospective joked afterward that nobody else on Earth could have gotten away with spraying whipped cream down Johnny's pants and still gotten invited back. That was the magic of their relationship. Reynolds showed up ready for elaborate pranks and physical bits, and Carson happily played the straight man, letting Reynolds' roguish, mischievous energy take center stage. Behind-the-scenes footage from the 70s shows the two of them goofing around during photo shoots, completely comfortable with each other, like old friends who happened to be on national television. Reynolds later described Carson simply as the funniest guy he knew, which says a lot coming from a man who spent his career working alongside some of the biggest comedic talents in the industry. Their partnership stretched across nearly the entire run of The Tonight Show, right up until March of 1992, when Reynolds returned for his final appearance just weeks before Carson himself retired from the show. It was a fitting way to close out a relationship built on decades of laughter, pranks, and genuine friendship that never once felt like a performance. Reynolds passed away in 2018, but these Tonight Show clips remain some of the clearest windows into who he really was off-screen. Not just the action hero audiences saw in theaters, but a genuinely funny, charismatic presence who could turn a simple interview into a moment of pure chaos in seconds. 61 appearances, one legendary whipped cream moment, and a friendship with Carson that never lost its spark. That's Burt Reynolds' legacy on that couch. This story almost never happened. Before Rodney Dangerfield became one of Johnny Carson's favorite guests of all time, he almost torpedoed the entire relationship before it even started. Back in April of 1969, Dangerfield sent Carson a letter accusing one of The Tonight Show's writers of stealing his jokes. That's not exactly how you'd expect a legendary partnership to begin. But somehow, the two of them worked things out, and just weeks later, on April 14, 1969, Dangerfield made his first appearance on the show. It was an instant hit. He completely won over both Carson and the audience in one shot, and what could have been a one-time awkward booking instead turned him into a regular fixture on the couch. From that point forward, Dangerfield became one of Carson's absolute favorite comedians, and the feeling clearly went both ways. His entire act was built around a simple, self-deprecating premise, the idea that he got no respect from anyone, anywhere, ever. He'd limp out on stage, deadpan his way through story after story about his own misfortunes, and somehow make it funnier every single time. Carson would sit there struggling to hold it together, laughing until he could barely breathe. By 1980, Dangerfield had hit an absolute career peak, starring in the film Caddyshack and releasing his Grammy-winning comedy album titled, fittingly, No Respect. Around this same period, his stand-up on The Tonight Show became even more outrageous, and Carson was reportedly laughing so hard during some of these sets that tears were running down his face. One show from 1979 captured Carson joking on air that Dangerfield deserved some actual respect, right as the routine had the entire audience jumping to its feet. Carson later said flat out that nobody else could make him laugh quite the way Rodney did. That's an enormous statement coming from a man who spent 3 decades hosting the funniest performers in America, night after night, for 30 straight years. Dangerfield kept appearing on the show from that first 1969 booking all the way through the 80s, eventually becoming something close to a Tonight Show institution. He passed away in 2004, but his signature line, the one about getting no respect, along with his wild, rapid-fire anecdotes, remains some of the most quoted and referenced bits in stand-up comedy history. A shaky start, an unlikely friendship, and one of the most beloved comedic voices Carson ever hosted. That's Rodney Dangerfield's legacy on that couch.
Your star working today. Would you welcome, please, Eddie Murphy?
21 years old, already unstoppable, and about to become one of the biggest names in comedy. That was Eddie Murphy the moment he stepped onto Johnny Carson's stage in 1982. Murphy landed on The Tonight Show 3 separate times that single year, appearing in January, February, and July, right as his career was hitting an explosive growth spurt. Saturday Night Live had already made him a rising star, and his breakout film 48 Hours was about to turn him into a full-blown movie phenomenon. In other words, this wasn't a young comic hoping for a break. This was a young comic in the middle of a rocket launch, and Carson's stage became one of the platforms fueling that ride. What stood out immediately was how edgy Murphy's material felt, even on network television, even in front of Carson's typically older, more traditional audience. He didn't soften his voice or play it safe. He brought his real stand-up energy straight onto that couch, and it worked. His February appearance in particular became legendary, a routine so sharp and so confident that it had the entire crowd completely locked in from start to finish. Carson noticed something in him beyond just the jokes. He responded to the sheer confidence radiating off this 21-year-old, the kind of natural star power that doesn't need years of seasoning to show up on screen. Carson welcomed him with the kind of genuine warmth usually reserved for performers he considered special, not just talented but undeniably going somewhere big. That instinct turned out to be right. Comedy Central would later rank Murphy inside the top 10 greatest stand-up comedians of all time, and a chunk of that reputation traces directly back to these early television appearances, moments where a barely adult comedian went toe-to-toe with one of the most respected hosts in the business and more than held his own. His third appearance that July marked his final time on Carson's show, arriving just before he left Saturday Night Live behind to chase full-time stardom in Hollywood. Today, Murphy stands as one of the most recognizable names in film, a career built across decades and dozens of roles. But those 3 appearances in 1982 captured something you can only catch once, a young performer right at the edge of superstardom, still raw, still hungry, making one of the most seasoned hosts in television history laugh with nothing but pure, undeniable talent. 3 appearances, 1 explosive year, and the beginning of a legend. That's Eddie Murphy's moment on Johnny Carson's couch.
You're on The Tonight Show. Would you welcome David Letterman?
November 24, 1978. That's the night David Letterman first stepped onto The Tonight Show, and almost immediately, Johnny Carson recognized he was looking at something different. Letterman's humor didn't sound like anything else on the show. Where Carson's style leaned warm and polished, Letterman brought something sardonic, almost behind the scenes in tone, like he was letting the audience in on a joke everyone else was too polite to make. It stood out instantly, and over the following years he kept coming back, each appearance sharpening that same deadpan, slightly rebellious energy that would eventually define his entire career. Carson noticed. Behind the scenes, he quietly began thinking of Letterman as a potential successor, someone who could eventually carry the Tonight Show torch. That respect became public in one of the show's most meaningful final stretches. In May of 1992, during Carson's very last weeks on air, he brought Letterman back one more time, sharing the stage alongside Clint Eastwood and Bob Hope. That lineup alone signals how much weight Carson placed on Letterman's presence during those closing shows. But the relationship wasn't without its complications. Letterman had spent time on staff writing monologues for the show, and he made no secret of wanting to eventually sit in the host chair himself. When NBC ultimately chose Jay Leno as Carson's official successor instead, Letterman didn't pretend to be fine with it. He joked openly that he still wasn't over the decision, and honestly, most people watching believed him. That mix of genuine friendship and real competitive tension gave their on-screen moments an edge that felt authentic rather than staged. Despite that disappointment, Letterman didn't slow down. He built late night into appointment television from 1982 through 1993, then carried that same voice into The Late Show from 1993 all the way to 2015, defining an entire era of late-night comedy along the way. He eventually retired in 2015 and now lives a quiet life away from television entirely. But it all traces back to that first Carson appearance in 1978, when a young comic with an unusual, almost anti-establishment sense of humor caught the attention of the biggest host in the business. Carson saw the potential immediately, gave him a platform to develop it, and even in the face of a very public succession battle, never stopped respecting what Letterman brought to the table. One night in 1978, years of appearances that followed, and a legacy that would go on to reshape late-night television entirely. That's David Letterman's story on Johnny Carson's couch.
Good to be here, and yeah, well, little things.
I was at a restaurant last night where they did the reading, where they got...
Some records in television just don't get broken. George Carlin holds one of them. 105 appearances on The Tonight Show between 1967 and 1992, making him one of the single most frequent guests in the entire history of the program. Think about what that number actually means. This wasn't a comedian who showed up occasionally to promote a new special. Carlin became such a trusted presence that Carson regularly handed him the reins as guest host whenever he needed time off, and Carlin stepped into that chair with an ease very few other comedians could match. Comedy Central would later rank him the second greatest stand-up comedian of all time, and a huge portion of that reputation was built right there on Carson's stage, appearance after appearance, year after year. His comedy didn't stay in one place either. Carlin started out fairly mainstream in the late 60s, but by the 70s he had fully transformed into something else entirely, the sharp, fearless voice of counterculture comedy. His most famous bit, built around the 7 words you supposedly couldn't say on television, became one of the defining moments in stand-up comedy history. On Carson's show specifically, he mostly kept things clean, but he'd occasionally push right up to the edge just to see how far the line could stretch. Carson respected that instinct. He admired the wit underneath the boundary pushing and consistently gave Carlin the space to be exactly who he was. One of the most memorable nights in the show's history came on May 20, 1981, when Carson announced he had 2 of the biggest names in comedy on stage together, George Carlin and Richard Pryor. Watching 2 legends of that caliber play off each other in real time created something television rarely captures, and it remains one of the most talked about pairings in late-night history. Then came May 13, 1992, during Carson's own final stretch on the show. Carlin returned for his 105th and absolute final appearance, a milestone Carson acknowledged on air with real, visible emotion. Carson later called him one of his favorite guys in the business, praising both his intelligence and his craft in interviews outside the show itself. Carlin kept performing right up until he passed away in 2008. His decades-long battles over censorship and language pushed stand-up comedy into places it had never gone before, and Carson's stage was where much of that evolution played out in front of a national audience. 105 appearances, a legendary pairing with Richard Pryor, and a final bow that closed out one of the most important comedic careers in television history. That's George Carlin's legacy on Johnny Carson's couch.
It's here on NBC, of course. Will you welcome Jay Leno?
March of 1977 marked the first time Jay Leno walked onto The Tonight Show, and the connection with the audience was immediate. There was no slow build, no awkward adjustment period. From that very first appearance, something clicked, and it never really stopped clicking for the next 15 years. Leno's style leaned street smart and observational, built on that unmistakable lopsided grin and a delivery that felt conversational rather than performed. Carson responded to it consistently, laughing through appearance after appearance as Leno kept sharpening that same relatable, everyday voice that would eventually become his signature. By 1987, that trust had grown into something bigger. Leno became Carson's go-to substitute host whenever Johnny needed a break, stepping in and holding the audience's attention like he'd been doing it for years. Word spread quickly around NBC. By the early 90s, most people inside the network already assumed Leno was the natural heir to the entire show. Then came one of the most public succession battles in television history. The competition between Leno and David Letterman played out constantly in the press, each side with passionate supporters, both comedians clearly aware of what was at stake. In the end, NBC made its decision, officially naming Leno the new host of The Tonight Show starting in May of 1992. Carson and Leno shared one final broadcast together on May 15, 1992, reflecting on Leno's early career and the long road that led him to that chair. Clint Eastwood joined them that night as well, a clear sign of just how much weight and star power surrounded Leno as he prepared to take over one of the most important seats in television. The numbers backed up the hype instantly. When Leno officially debuted as host on May 25, 1992, 22 million viewers tuned in to watch. He went on to host The Tonight Show all the way until 2009, stepped away briefly during a chaotic network shakeup, returned for a short stretch, then left again for good in 2014. Today, Leno has stepped back from nightly hosting entirely, but he never actually stopped performing. He still tours regularly as a stand-up comedian, doing the exact same thing that got him noticed by Carson back in 1977 in the first place. 15 years building trust with one of the most respected hosts in television, a hard-fought public battle for the biggest share in late night, and a debut watched by 22 million people. That's Jay Leno's story on Johnny Carson's couch.
Welcome, Robin Williams.
There was no comedian on Johnny Carson's stage quite like Robin Williams. Not close. When Williams walked out, nobody, including Carson himself, ever knew exactly what was about to happen. Williams started appearing on the show in 1981, right as his fame from Mork and Mindy was reaching its absolute peak. Over the years that followed, he made 9 unforgettable visits, each one bringing that same trademark manic energy and stream of consciousness style that felt less like a rehearsed set and more like watching lightning happen live on television. One appearance from 1986 became instantly legendary. Williams jumped between multiple characters at breakneck speed, completely abandoning any semblance of a script, improvising at a pace that genuinely looked superhuman. Carson lost his composure repeatedly during that segment, barely able to hold himself together on camera. Johnny later described Williams as something like a whirlwind on stage, and even that description didn't fully capture what it felt like to watch in real time. Then came May 21, 1992, one of the most emotionally loaded nights of Carson's entire final stretch. Williams returned for Carson's second-to-last episode ever, sharing the stage alongside Bette Midler. Carson introduced him that night as a dear friend, and what followed became the stuff of television legend. Williams unleashed rapid-fire jokes that blended perfectly with Midler's musical performance, sending the entire studio into an absolute frenzy. Midler ended up winning an Emmy for her performance that same night, capping off one of the most unforgettable episodes in the show's history. What made Williams so effective wasn't just raw energy. It was contrast. Carson's humor was measured, controlled, precisely timed. Williams was explosive, unpredictable, constantly threatening to spiral in 5 directions at once. Put those two side by side, and the result was electric television, every single time, without exception. Williams passed away in 2014, but those Carson appearances remain some of the most rewatched, most shared comedy clips in existence. Fans continue rediscovering them today, and they hold up exactly the way they did decades ago, because nobody has ever quite replicated that specific kind of chaotic brilliance. 9 appearances, 1 legendary improvised meltdown of laughter in 1986, and a final bow alongside Bette Midler that closed out one of the most electric comedic relationships Carson ever had. That's Robin Williams' legacy on that couch.